Okay, we are back, Rosebuds. You just heard our first part with Derek Van Gorder. He's a cameraman, a YouTuber, and a philosopher. He had proposed a radical philosophy, or maybe not so radical as we just found out, of radical kindness. That was his first top priority, and as he hinted in that segment, one of the ways we can achieve radical kindness is basic income. Derek, basic income is your second top priority. How did this become such a big topic for you?
Well, I have to thank Yang because before I encountered Andrew Yang, I was thinking in terms of more resource distribution policies. I came back from a more socialist or distributionist philosophical background. And when I heard him talking about it, I got very interested in the idea. It occurred to me that if we were going to have the government or any institution distribute lots of things to people for free, well, what would be the most efficient way to do that? And since money can be exchanged for goods in whatever way you prefer,
Hmm.
it just kind of makes it much more efficient and it maximizes people's preferences. So I first learned about the idea through him, and then I went to events. I went to um, the Washington Square Park event that he held, and I met
Hmm.
some at some debate watch parties of his. I met some people involved in the income movement, what's called the income movement now. They used to be called Basic Income NYC,
Hmm.
and through them I met a guy named Alex Howlett, and he's an economic theorist, and he has a framework he calls consumer monetary theory. And he got into the nitty gritty of it and answered some of the unanswered questions I had and talked about basic income in a very different way than even Yang talks about it. And that's when I got really, really into the idea. And I looked at it in this entirely new way, and in a way that I think is still unusual for many, many basic income advocates, even. But I'm fairly convinced that this that convinced me for sure. I felt very solid that this policy, basic income, is the most important missing feature of our economy.
I think that's interesting. I guess we didn't get to cross paths when we were both at that Washington Square Park event, and it's going to
We
be.
walked by,
I
yeah.
know, I know. It's kind of a shame that it only came now that we got to talk to one another. But it's also going to be interesting. We're going to be having Alex Hallett also on the program in the future, so hopefully they
That's
can hear
great.
more about that in the near future. My question on basic income: I think there's a question between whether or not this should be universal basic income or basic income. Do you have a preference between the two?
Oh, for the name, um,
No, no, no.
my
In practice too. One has a
ah
means tested floor, so it's a basic income. Everyone below this level of income will make sure they are risen to that level, versus universal basic income, which is you simply give that amount of money to everyone.
mm. I tend to use the terms interchangeably because I think that for a lot of people, when they say the term, I prefer to call it basic income, but maybe I mean something a little different than this category because I certainly don't think it should be means tested restricted. Um, I think that the basic refers to I think it refers to the fact that it's a base of the economy. It's a floor, and that means everyone in that economy gets it. So universal is kind of almost redundant. Some people, when they say basic, what they're talking about is like as if it's supposed to cover someone's basic needs. But I don't think about it in that way. I don't think that basic income necessarily has to be limited to that amount. And I also don't think that in some economic cases, you can imagine it where it wouldn't matter what your basic needs are. The maximum basic income might not be enough to cover those. It depends on your economy. Um, and so I prefer to just call it basic income, but I definitely don't think that it should be means tested restricted. I think that defeats the purpose of it, and it should be universal as much as possible.
I agree with you there. I personally feel that it should be a universal program because that largely A makes it much less bureaucratic because you don't have to do the means testing processes and doing the paperwork for it. It becomes a lot more politically sustainable because you're not having an us versus them kind of that zero sum game that you were kind of talking about beforehand. Everyone is getting it now. And furthermore, it kind of gets treated more as a basic right when everyone gets it. I think there's something morally to be said that everyone, when there's a government benefit provided, should have access to it. My question for you is I know you were inspired first by Yang. How did you feel about Yang's freedom dividend? Were there any differences you have in terms of how you would like to see one structured compared to how he proposed one?
Hmm. Yeah. when I first heard of it, I immediately liked it, and I still like it. I still think it's a much better economic policy than really what we have going on today in our social safety net. Um, I think that I had uh, differences with the way that he framed it, both in the way that it should be paid for with a 10% VAT, and I also have differences in how it may have been framed in terms of requiring a cut to certain welfare programs or an opt-in. Right, that caused a lot of
Hmm.
issues with people, but it's a nuanced topic because really what basic income does is it saves the government money on those programs by rendering some of them unnecessary. That doesn't mean that in order to have it, we have to cut those programs out. However, that's a hard message to get across to some people. So I understand why Yang would put it the way he did. And I think one of the reasons that he was so successful in attracting the independent crowd and the more conservative crowd was because he was stressing that this was more efficient. So it's murky waters there. Um, but also, yes, I don't think that it. I think that if we have to have a tax attached to the basic income, a 10% VAT is a decent one. Like that, we could do that. But I currently think that central bank policy is already stimulating markets so much with credit
Hmm.
that in terms of any inflationary concern, all we really have to think about basic income doing is actually changing that balance. So you're raising the basic income, monetary policy is going to react to lower the credit that's built our economy around. So businesses will get a little less credit, but there's going to be more consumer spending for them to capitalize on. Consumers aren't going to maybe, it'll be a little harder to get that credit card, but you're going to have real money, which is what we prefer. So to some extent, we can if we need taxation, maybe we could talk about something like that. But I don't think we do. I think that basic income is an alternative to credit, essentially.
I think that's definitely an interesting argument. I do worry that I am in favor of giving the money directly to the people compared to these centralized institutions, but I don't think we can say that it's going to have the exact same impacts inflationary wise, because when you put the hands into something like Wall Street, you're going to be
Hmm.
investing into businesses that don't necessarily have consumer products. Sometimes it can be business services that they're handling, or that they are helping the financing of new technology that's not necessarily consumer based. While consumers, they're going to be buying more often goods and services. So it's a little bit different in structure, even though I do still favor it. Do you have any, in terms of the argument there, do you think there needs to be some at least baseline we're paying for it in some regard? Or do you think it should be completely like an MMT style, just it doesn't matter if we're paying for it or not?
Well, of course, it depends on your theory. I believe what's most likely is the view put forth by consumer monetary theory, which agrees with MMT in one respect, in that it's not accurate to say that taxes pay for spending. What pays for spending is productivity, production of real goods of the economy. I disagree with a lot of stuff that MMT says otherwise. I
Mm-hmm.
think they have some strange ideas. But what really matters is inflation. And I'm going to say full stop. We should not, and in fact, really can't. We should not implement any amount of basic income that causes aggregate inflation above the central bank's policy targets. They use monetary policy to hit, roughly 2% inflation rate. If you start going over that with the basic income, you've given too much basic income. You have to reduce the basic income. So I'm a hardliner on that. I just don't think that taxes necessarily help with that. I think in many cases the taxes that we have reduce the inflationary ceiling of basic income. It
Mm-hmm.
depends on the tax. Taxes can be really useful for conserving resources, changing incentives in the market. But the assumption the public has today is that every time you spend, you have to have an equivalent raise in taxes. And that doesn't seem to be true macroeconomically. I know that there's a lot of debate about that. I've just looked at it and it doesn't seem likely to me.
Yeah, I do agree with you there. And I do think that's actually one of the biggest appeals to me about like the VAT too, is that it actually is a form of kind of price control in the market to help combat inflation. Because if you're a consumer and you see that there's a new 10% VAT that's been applied to a product, you already have that kind of price sensitivity built in that if a company decides they want to raise it even more, you're going to be really shocked and probably not go to that product. So it has some already capping on how much inflation a company can say when you have a new $1,000 into the system, because that tax is starting to pull some of that $1,000 back to the government in return. So I do think that there needs to be some form of taxation, but I do agree that it doesn't need to be completely funded. It's okay that we do some just direct investment to the people without taxation funding it. I wanted to ask you about the universality of the program. In that method of zero sum that you said, would you say that it should be truly universal, meaning that people in prison should be receiving it as well as children?
Right. So this is an open question. I haven't made up my mind about the children part. I think it's quite possible there's an argument to be made there. But then there are questions. Well, should it be the same? Should we reduce it? I think that there's something to be said for a parent's fiscal control of the household. I don't know. I'm open-minded on that. I actually really like Yang's position that you don't get it for the duration that you're in prison because the state's paying for your stay there, and we need to think about money as how it affects people's incentives, and that's a pretty good one because it means people have a very strong incentive to stay out of jail. So you're correct to point that out, and maybe that contradicts something I said earlier, which is that true universality in the most extreme sense is not necessarily implied with the basic income, and maybe that is another reason why I should be using the term basic income.
Yeah.
But I do think that it should go to every citizen over the age of 18 at the very at least that. So it should be universal in that sense.
Yeah, I tend to agree that there can be some limitations set to it. For example, for a child, universal basic income, I do advocate for one, but I wouldn't say it should be at the same level. I do think it should be at 500 potentially. That's kind of the area I'm in, $300 to $500 roughly. And I say that because we as America currently have the highest childhood poverty rate in the world. And when you look at the percentage of homeless children, it is a lot higher than you would believe. It's, I think, at around 20% currently. And so you have to have some methods of being able to give autonomy to these children, these minors, who wouldn't necessarily have parents in the household, or potentially who had parents, but now they're incarcerated and they're no longer getting that basic income themselves from that parent. So I think there's a lot of reasons we should be considering a child UBI, maybe not at the same level as the adults UBI. And for prisons, I go back and forth on this one myself, because in an ideal world, if we didn't have so much racial discrimination in our prison systems, I would agree with you in the incentives. However, I do feel like this creates a large structure to potentially increase discrimination, because now we are taking that money away from those communities of colors if we're throwing them away in jail currently. And when we have the highest incarcerated population on earth, I do fear that that is a restriction. It's basically stealing money from the public by just simply locking them up instead. Do you think that there is an incentive, is the incentive strong enough to deal with the current reality? Because I feel like when we're talking incentives in this case, it's almost in an idealistic sense rather than where we are right now.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I would say in general that basic income, and maybe we'll get into this in the third section, but basic income makes such a radical change to the incentive structure that we're used to that I think it's very hard to say. And I do think that my attitude towards that is that, well, we need to try implementing this in whatever form that becomes expedient and sort of notice what happens. I do think that basic income will radically decrease the intake of into these prisons. And to me, that is the most important thing is that you've got to kind of figure out where the leak in the ceiling is coming from before you start mopping up the floor, right?
Yeah.
I mean, both are important. And so there's a question of what to do with this enormous prison population that we've unnecessarily created. And that's an important question. But we also need to make sure that we stop putting people in prisons as well. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think in my mind, it might be something where you try to do it at first. You start by giving it to both, but then as the prison population declines, or you can get some prison reform in, you could potentially have that as a bargaining chip, saying universal basic income will no longer be given to this prison population in return for some criminal justice reforms in the first place. I kind of see that as a potential bargaining chip. But the last question I wanted to ask you on the subject of basic income before we get to political polarization is, do you think that we should be implementing this on a national level, a state level, or a local level? Obviously, it'd be ideal if we could get it to a national level, but do you think we should be looking to also implement it on state and local levels?
There are challenges to implementing it on the state and local level in terms of local governments. The local governments don't have the kind of budget flexibility that the federal government does. And what I said earlier about kind of changing the flow of credit versus money, that's something that the central bank oversees, and that's by definition a federal program. So I do think there, when you talk about local governments, they do have to tax and get the money somehow and then distribute it. They have some leeway with credit, but it's really not as much. So you introduce a lot of challenges on the local level, whereas the federal one you would not. Um, when I think about a local basic income, I'm much more optimistic about a kind of alternative currency approach. Some people are interested in a digital currency, UBI, that could kind of spring up pockets locally and then coalesce into something larger. That's just kind of a strategy we might use if, for whatever reason, the federal government just doesn't want to give us a UBI. Then you want to start thinking in that direction. And my favorite one is something called Project Gresham, which is again by Alex Howlett. Yeah, lacking that, I do think it's most expedient to go towards the federal level. I wouldn't be against a state experiment, but I would want to be I would want to stress that that's going to have problems and challenges that aren't affected on the larger scale.
Do you think those experiments can then be compared to the national levels? I know Yang always uses the Alaska example using oil money and $1,000 a year instead of a month. Do you think those experiments can actually be compared to what is being proposed on a national level?
Not quite. What those do a good job of showing are the effects of direct cash transfers. So if you want to know what happens to people when you give them money, do they get healthier? Do they pursue education more? Well, it turns out, yeah, it pretty much helps people, and we sort of know that. And if you want more evidence, then we can look to those as examples. But it doesn't really tell us what is really interesting, which is what are the macroeconomic effects. It doesn't confirm those predictions. I'm very confident in the positive macroeconomic effects. So doing it on the state level or local level, it's not going to tell you much about that.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you there. And I will say one of the most encouraging metrics that I've seen out of Alaska for this is they have the lowest economic inequality of the entire country. So I think that is something to be said when we've been talking about how there is this huge gulf. Programs like this have already tested to show that this can reduce that gap. But with that being said, Rosebuds, we're going to take another quick break, and then we're going to get into Derek's final topic, which is political polarization. So we'll be right back.